picked up a book fairly recently by Karen Armstrong, which has the title, A History of God. And I've begun reading that book, and I must admit that I was rather dumbfounded and amazed by the very first sentence of the book. The book begins by talking about a theologian who wrote back in 1919 about God and how we have come to our understanding of God. And Karen Armstrong begins her book with these words: "In the beginning, human beings created their gods." Do you sense the import of that opening sentence? The amazing turnaround and the intentional purpose of that to bring our conception of God totally upon its head by comparison with what we have in Scripture. You open the first pages of the Bible, in the book of Genesis, and there you read, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." But here, in a description of this God and other gods, Karen Armstrong begins by saying, "In the beginning, human beings created their gods." It's an astounding start to a book which has been on the New York Times bestseller list and has been highly recommended by many, and in many ways does a great job at synthesizing modern thought and modern conceptions about God and where we are at today, where in some ways I think what she tries to do is form a picture of one absolute God up above everything and all different kinds of religions being different versions of that and working out from there. She goes into the Jewish experience of God and talks about how the pagan deities around there and the Canaanites and so forth formed their conceptions of God, and perhaps the Jews borrowed from that to a certain extent. They adopted the God El, the Most High God, and made Him their God, perhaps. When we turn to the pages of Scripture and find what the Scriptures say about God, we find a totally different conception, it seems to me, of God and His character. And I think our Larger Catechism does an excellent job, or at least a very good job, at capturing what the Scriptures say about who God is. At the very start, when we think about God, I think we should be rather humbled. Anyone who asks the question, how do you define God, has really got to be asking a magnificent question for which you wonder whether any description could be complete or any description of God be adequate. How can you really define God? Can you take God and distill Him into an analytical definition that fully satisfies a description of God? Clearly, no definition is adequate. It is like taking a snapshot picture of someone and saying, this is what Sally Joe is. Well, it gives you a picture of one portion of what Sally Joe is like, but the whole experience of who Sally Joe is goes far beyond what that snapshot can do. So our definition of God has merit, as I'll explain in a moment. It is, I think, faithful to Scripture. But in some ways, we have to acknowledge that God is above and beyond our definitions. And we'll talk about that in just a moment. But in talking about the Larger Catechism, it asks the question, what is God? And the answer is a little bit longer than what you find in the Shorter Catechism. And quite frankly, I think it seems somewhat disorganized, kind of like it was thrown together, and hard to decipher. The Shorter Catechism definition for what is God is very succinct, crisp, and to the point. And I think we should all memorize it. God is a spirit, infinite, eternal, and unchangeable in His being, wisdom, power, holiness, justice, goodness, and truth. You could not get a more succinct, crisp answer for who is God. The first section describes God's incommunicable attributes, those attributes which are unique to Him. He is infinite, eternal, and unchangeable. And then the second half describes His communicable attributes, those things which we share with God, His wisdom, power, holiness, justice, goodness, and truth. So it's a very well-defined, sharp, precise definition for God. The Larger Catechism is lugubrious. It's long-winded. It's a little bit complex. But it does advance our understanding of God. And I think expands on the definition of the Shorter Catechism in ways that are important for those of us who are adults. And I want to highlight two aspects of the Larger Catechism answer that I think come to the fore and which are very important for us as adults, whether we be young people getting started in life, or those of us who are more mature, or I shouldn't say more mature. That implies that the younger folks are immature. I don't want to say that. Those of us who are older, seasoned citizens, I guess is the way to describe it. But as we go along in life, some of the aspects of this Larger Catechism question, I think, are important to hold on to and grasp. And as I conceive the Larger Catechism answer, and I'll give it here in just a moment, it seems to me that it is well reflected in our text in Exodus chapter 3. These two emphases are also the emphases of our text. The Larger Catechism question is answered in this way. God is a spirit, in and of Himself, infinite, in being, glory, blessedness, and perfection. All-sufficient, eternal, and unchangeable. Incomprehensible. Everywhere present. Almighty. Knowing all things. Most wise. Most holy. Most just. Most merciful and gracious. Long-suffering. And abounding in goodness and truth. Now that's quite a mouthful, isn't it? I had to work on that. And I'm not quite sure I got every word right. But that's the definition that comes to us in the Larger Catechism. And it sounds like a jumble of words, doesn't it? But I think there are two emphases that come to the fore in that answer that are important and are reflected in Moses' experience at the burning bush. First of all, there is the emphasis which comes at the very start of the Catechism answer on God's self-existence. God lives in and of Himself. His being is independent of anything that we would contribute to Him. He is not dependent upon us for fellowship. He's not dependent upon the creation for His blessedness. As the Catechism begins, it says that in and of Himself, He is blessed and perfect. And so God's self-existence is asserted here. His distinction from the creation. And it's an important distinction that we need to maintain because it will help us in trusting God, in resting in Him, and in following Him. But the second emphasis also is important for us, especially as we grow older in life. As you look at the latter half of the Larger Catechism answer, it seems to dwell on the mercies, the grace, the long-suffering, the goodness of God. The Shorter Catechism just mentions the goodness of God.